headlines in 2023 was the release of Janusz Walus from prison. While many South Africans were furious, and some believe that his release presented an opportune time for us to revisit the country's parole system and prisoner rehabilitation programs. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Golden Miles Bhudu from the South African Prisoners Organization for Human Rights. He joins us via telephone link as we all deal with the Kremlin that is load shedding. Miles, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us on the Weekend Report this morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for your views and fellow South Africans.
Well, I want you to talk to us about, the issue that was raised by a number of South Africans in the aftermath of the release of Janusz Walus, that being that it did seem it was being treated as an individualized matter, when we know that there are so many other political prisoners who are still reeling in our correctional facilities, waiting for an opportunity to become eligible for parole.
Well, I think fellow South Africans by now know where this whole thing started. 10 years ago there was a Van Vuuren 1 and 2 Constitutional Court decision. It was followed up by a Van Wyk decision. And far more frequently it was followed up by the Pasha constitutional judgment. And if my memory serves me well, the Department of Correctional Services should have released some of them 5 years ago, if not 10 years ago, if the judgment of Van Vuuren and Opa Pasha, and by the way, Opa Pasha is still languishing in prison. He's been told that his profile must go for another 24 months. But with Van Vuuren and Van Wyk, there was no profile of being read by a psychologist, social workers' reports, anger management, victim offender dialogue, and victim offender mediation. There was no such things. Now, if sanity prevails, Walus also should have been released 10 years ago if we kept to the book, but it did not happen because the executive got heavily involved in the interference of the criminal justice in general, in the Correctional Services Act in particular, and in sub-particular interfering with the release policy and the parole regime to keep, and the intention was to keep Walus and Clive Baby Lewis for the rest of their miserable natural life behind bars. And that, in fact, had a rippling effect on hundreds and thousands of lifers that are still rotting in prison. And by the way, journalist Louise Flanagan, on the 15th of March 2013, she wrote that the way the executive has tempered and interfered with the release policy and the Correctional Services Act and the parole regime, it's going to take them 90 years to process all lifers that are requesting for being released on parole.
Yeah. Well, Miles, no doubt the Constitutional Court order with respect to Janusz Walus's own parole was pretty seminal in perhaps addressing some of the interference that you are bringing to our attention that's been taking place over the last couple of years or so. Now that we have a legal precedent in place and we have legal instruments that can facilitate the release of some of these prisoners that, as you say, have been languishing in prison for all these years, what's to stop that process from getting underway? From your perspective, what is hampering the process from getting underway?
Look, the interference of the executive was so thick that Dimpo Hani was ultimately dumped, parachuted into the Department of Correctional Services Portfolio Committee on Correctional Services during those times. That is how thick the interference of the executive was. And she went there, immediately when she got there as a chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Correctional Services, she decided to ban marriages in prison. And even up to today, marriages in prison remain banned. But let me go back to your original question. What needs to be done? The Department of Correctional Services is a law unto themselves, because when you push them to the brink, they tell you that, look, parole in any event is a privilege and not a right. Now, this lifeless parole release policy and parole regime is so contaminated and it is so rotten that every minister, every commissioner that comes on board bury this whole thing of life as under the cement wall. But we need to break that wall, and we can only do that by asking lifers who should have been released some time ago to start doing something. They need not to be violent. Start to do something about their law, because the Constitutional Court has spoken, and the Constitutional Court is no more going to speak on this matter. And the reason is the Department of Correctional Services is there on their own. They run this institution like a Bantu stunt. They report to nobody else but themselves, and they get away with it in any event because nobody wants to have anything to do with people who are in prison until such time you end up in prison yourself, or somebody very near to you end up in prison yourself.
Well, Miles, you've also been quoted as saying that political parties have, in essence, forgotten some of their members who are languishing behind bars. Is that a sentiment that you still stand by? Is that a call that you're making on political parties to mobilize and rally behind their members who were sent behind bars for their actions and have done their time and served their sentence to society, and should be often offered an opportunity for early release?
Well, look, this is what I keep on saying, the deficit of leadership in this country. This is the cowardice of people which we call leaders. These people are not leaders. These people are scoundrels and scumbags. They have forgotten people who were part of them when fighting for the liberation of this country. I mean, we've got IFP political leaders. We've got Buramach, MK, Apla, Azanla political prisoners, which they have forgotten. And these political parties should have reminded the government of the day that it is almost 30 years in a democracy. We still have freedom fighters that are languishing and rotting in your prison. What is that you guys are doing? No, they keep themselves busy with these other things that are popular, bringing the Department of Correctional Services release policy and parole regime into disrepute perpetually.
Well, Miles, thank you so much for helping us to bring this issue to our viewers' attention. Thank you so much for joining us on our program and, of course, sharing your insights with us.